Welcome back to the next lecture on World War II, where we're going to be talking about how America is getting ready to mobilize for defense. Remember, we left off chapter 24 in the last lecture, where Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese and America declared war against the Japanese. And so this lecture we're going to look at how did the war have a specific impact on industry and the service sectors of the economy, and then how it affected men, women, and minorities as well. So the first thing that needs to happen is that America needs more men. And so after Pearl Harbor was bombed, more than 5 million men signed up to join in the military, which is great. It's one of the highest numbers of volunteers of all time. But the United States would need more than 10 million, and so they had to institute a draft. And this is what's called, the draft is called the Selective Service Act here. That's the name of it. And after men's numbers were drafted, or they signed up, they reported for 10 weeks of basic training around the United States before they were shipped off. And in this picture here, you can actually see military generals out of a bowl here picking draft numbers. So if your draft number was picked, that was assigned to you, or your section of numbers, I should say. It was based on your birthday when you were born. Then you were called up and you went into the draft. Once you got in there, this is a picture of the initial health screening to see the overall health of the men and where they should be assigned. The second area of volunteers is the Women Auxiliary Army Corps. In May 1942, the WAAC was established, and it allowed for women volunteers to serve in non-combat roles such as nurses, ambulance drivers, radio operators, etc. They received a full salary if they volunteered for this position, but they didn't receive all of the same benefits as the GIs or the soldiers at this time, but it was a way for women to, get involved, make a difference, show their patriotism, and a way to earn money as well. Another interesting thing about the war is that there was, in World War II, a high participation of minorities. That there was a big dilemma at this time because the war created a dilemma for them. A lot of them saw that they were fighting a war against others for the white man to stay free around the world. And so there was some disconnect there. And while they continued to live in segregated communities around the United States, a lot of them felt like, well, what's the point of really dying for freedom like we say we are? We're protecting freedom around the world when we're not free in the United States. So there was some disconnect. Even though there was some disconnect, you have high participation rates. More than 1 million African Americans, 300,000 Mexicans, 13,000 Chinese, or 1 in 5 Chinese men, and 25,000 Native Americans all joined the war effort to serve in the war. While they did not receive the same equal protection like African Americans served in segregated units, they were looked upon favorably. The African American Air Force Legion, the Tuskegee Airmen, are some of the most decorated airmen in American Air Force history when they fought in Italy, specifically during the Second World War. 33 Japanese joined the war as spies and interpreters, and if it wasn't for them, we would not be as successful as we were against the Japanese. A lot of Japanese soldiers would go on the front lines and translate exactly what the Japanese were saying to give the U.S. or interpretation. And Native Americans in particular were praised for their high rates of participation, considering 25,000 joined the war, and there wasn't many left within the United States. So the minorities did make a huge contribution to the war, and sometimes they're overlooked, so I think it's important to remember that. Production in the United States. Now remember, this is coming at the end of the Great Depression. So the Great Depression really ends because of the World War here. Look at this. You have production almost at zero in both of these cases. The budget of the United States right here is very low, and you have aircraft and ship production very low as well. Because of the war, it skyrockets into unprecedented levels at this time. And entire factories and industries turned from the private sector to mass production of war things, like a mechanical pencil factory turned out bomb parts, or car factories more bomb parts, or a soft drink company filled gun shells instead of filling drink bottles. So the whole idea is that this war really mobilized the country in a way that it wasn't for the prior 15 years because of the Great Depression. So this is kind of the best thing that could have happened to the United States to really pull itself out of the Depression. So labor in the United States, because we needed to produce so much, so fast, there was a huge demand for labor. So at first, before the draft started drafting tons of people, men went back to work in droves. People were hiring people, or companies were hiring people left and right. But as they began to leave and serve in the military, there wasn't enough men to fill both the jobs in the military and the industry. And so they looked to two primary things. One, they looked to women to fill those roles. And two, they looked into minorities. And so at first, women were thought to lack the stamina to complete jobs like welding or rivet guns. But many companies started to hire women because on average they earned 60% less than the men. So they could hire a bunch of women. The company could save money and they could produce the same amount of goods. And this is where you get the image of Rosie the Riveter right here. The idea that women are just as strong as men. They can do a lot of the same things. And they really become heralded for their strength and their effort, willing to help out their families and their country at this time. And so you see, this is the most iconic image of Rosie. She's got her headband on, her sleeves pulled back. She's willing to do anything she's asked. And before the war, the same thing happened with minorities. Up to 85% of jobs just refused to hire African Americans. And at this time, companies ended up hiring more than 2 million African Americans to fill roles that were empty because people were fighting in the war. And so, they, at the same time, are heralded as well as being strong workers. Companies get over their racist ideologies and really start to realize that there's nothing different about an African American worker than a regular white American worker. And they start to hire them in droves, which is, we'll talk about later in our lectures, why so many African Americans continue to leave the South. It's at this time as well that both groups, women and minorities, fight for rights. In particular, African Americans marched on Washington in July 1941 in the right before Pearl Harbor, when industry was heating up to send, products around the globe and stuff. And Roosevelt knew that it was just a matter of time before we were going into the war. So he issued an executive order calling on employers and labor unions to provide equal pay and a justification to African American workers. And this really is important because it allows, once we get into the war, for employers to hire African Americans. And it provides the law already in place for them to do so. And this becomes vital as industries looking for jobs. So, at the same time, the U.S. government is drafting people. They're forcing companies to provide equal rights in the industry to African Americans. They do take more control of the economy, similar to what happened in World War II, where the government steps in to make sure that we can produce as much as we need. And the two important things that I want you to know here are the Office of Price Administration. And what that does is it fought inflation from prices rising by freezing prices, wages, and rents. This made sure that, at this time when goods are producing so fast and money is being produced, inflation can happen, so goods can become very expensive, which is bad in a time of war. And so this, purposely set price structure so that wouldn't happen. It also rationed things that were in high demand, like foods, meats, butters, cheeses, sugars, coffee, anything that is in high demand right now that could be sold for high prices. It rationed all of those. And the way it rationed it, if you don't know what a ration is the process of establishing a fixed allotment of goods And so what that means is each household received a book, kind of like a coupon book, if you will, where based on the number of people living in your house. And that was, you would use this coupon when you're buying goods. So when you went to the store to buy things such as meat, you would see what rations you have. You'd get your meat. When you check out, not only would you need the money for the food, but you'd also need that ration coupon that said you had enough rations to buy it. And this was good for things like sugar, coffee, even gasoline and shoes that were in high demand right now. And as a result, as always, there was a black market that developed where people could sell their unused coupons. But that was okay because you know what? It meant that money was flowing for the first time out of savings and into the open market, which really helped improve the economy from the Great Depression. It also gave Americans a sense of pride because they were able to tighten their belts and feel very patriotic about doing it. The other important thing that you need to know is the War Production Board, which rationed in particular food and materials that were vital to the war effort. And so, you were still able to use gasoline and heating oil and rubber and plastics, all that stuff, but they put a limit on how much you could use because the whole idea was that you wanted to preserve things that would be in high demand that the government would need for soldiers. At this time, and we're going to talk about this a little more in depth, but not only is industry developing, but so is, science. And specifically, the government creates the Office of Scientific Research and Development, and it started in 1941 by Roosevelt. And they're responsible for things like pesticides, like DDT to eliminate insects on plants, so food production rises. It starts the Manhattan Project, which will create the atomic bomb and actually end the war in Japan. It also creates penicillin, which becomes a miracle drug, especially for soldiers in the war who need these drugs because they have high risks of injury. And if you don't know what the Manhattan Project is, my guess is you may be familiar from science class, but the Manhattan Project was the code name for the U.S. governmental project that developed the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb was set to take years to develop, and so the government poured tons of money into this project to shorten the timeline. Because they knew if they could get an atomic bomb faster, they could potentially use that to end the war faster. And all the research was actually done in Columbia University, or at Columbia University, in Manhattan, which is how they got the name the Manhattan Project. They then carry out the tests in New Mexico before they end up dropping 2 atomic bombs on Japan, which we'll talk about in the next lecture for how they end the war. So, let's do a quick review. How did the war have an effect on industry and service? Well, industry, rates skyrocketed at this time. You have both production going up and you have prices that stay the same because you have the government that's really trying to keep prices the way they're at. For the service sector of the economy, you have both men and women and minorities being hired in addition to being hired, being drafted at the highest rates. And so really it ends unemployment in America. If you want a job, there's a job for you between the military or some manual labor firm that needs your help. And so this really helps men provide for their family. They're going back to work for the first time in a decade, some men. Women and minorities, I should say, are becoming vital to the country's economy, and they're no longer looked at as second-class citizens for the first time, really, since World War II. They're given their status back, and they're appreciated for their work. And so the war is all around a good thing for America. It helps us out of the Depression. It puts money in Americans' pocket. It puts money in the economy, and it gives women and minorities a status and tells them they belong in America.